Stevie Wonder loved him. Michael Jackson was entranced by him, and fans of electronic dance music the world over regard him as a godfather of the genre. I'm the Classical Nerd, and today we're talking about Isao Tomita. Tomita was born in Tokyo in April 1932, but spent his early upbringing in China because his father was a physician in a textile mill there. He was 9 years old when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and ensnared the United States in World War II. Aside from crafting homemade bamboo flutes, he wasn't really all that musical. Tomita came back to Japan in 1939 and discovered Western music through broadcasts of the American occupying force after Japan had surrendered. He likened this experience to listening to music from outer space because Japan was so closed to Western influences for so long. He immersed himself in classical music as well as jazz and Latin and pop and rock and whatever he could get his ears on. He studied art history at Keio University, the oldest modern institution of higher learning in the country, and while he was there, he studied as much Western music as he could, up to and including getting composition lessons. After he graduated, he immediately launched into a career as a composer for film and television. In 1956, the year after he graduated, he was tasked with providing the theme tune for the Japanese gymnasts competing in the Melbourne Olympics that very year. For 15 years after that, contemporaneous with his other work, he received steady commissions from the Japanese public broadcasting company NHK. Tomita's career might have just been as a television composer, but he was eager to get into electronic music, which was just then coming into vogue in Europe. Edgard Varese, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, Janis Xenakis, and György Ligeti were all experimenting with electronics to one degree or another. And Delia Derbyshire had just done a rendition of the Doctor Who theme using all-electronic synthesis in 1963. This was something that was just coming into public knowledge. Mind you, this is all well before the advent of the synthesizer. In America, Robert Moog had started the company that came to basically invent the modern synthesizer, and Wendy Carlos had done these painstaking note-by-note recreations of Bach's music using Moog's synthesizers, bringing synthesized music into the public knowledge and the real forefront of what was considered an acceptable musical style. Stockhausen was a great composer, but the average member of the concert-going public is not going to necessarily enjoy a Stockhausen piece. Tomita entered this world at the right time, and he started building a home studio at the heart of which was going to lay a Moog synth, but it came at a steep price. He noted that there had been no new instruments added to the instrumental repertory since the time of Wagner, when Wagner commissioned his often out-of-tune Wagner tubas. And he desperately wanted a Moog synthesizer, since he'd seen it as part of Carlos's album Switched on Bach, but he could not find one in the entirety of Japan, so he had to actually fly to upstate New York to Moog's headquarters to purchase one directly, in what is now $125,000 in today's money. It's not something you could just plug into a wall and start playing either. These things were behemoths of instruments which had a very steep learning curve. But he couldn't get it started right away because when he tried to take this thing back to Japan, it got snagged by customs. They didn't believe that it was actually a musical instrument. Even Tomita's copy of Switched on Bach, with the Moog synth right there on the cover, wasn't enough to convince these officials. He had to get Moog to send a picture of the thing being performed, actually being used in a live performance on a stage and everything, before the customs officials actually allowed him to bring the instrument into the country. The resulting album, which consisted of electronic realizations of rock and pop tunes, was called Switched on Rock, in homage to the Carlos album it was inspired by. It came out in Japan in 1972, and was released in the United States 2 years later. Instead of simply substituting synthesis for real live instruments, Tomita realized that the power of the synthesizer was far greater, and he started doing his own sound designs instead of just imitating other instruments that actually existed. He also was able to figure out a way to substitute vocal parts in these songs with synthesized speech. While much of what was new and exciting in Tomita's work is now easily and readily accessible in even the most basic of sequencing softwares, what he had to do in order to achieve these effects in the 1970s is just unthinkably difficult. For his second album, Arrangements of Debussy Pieces, he replicated a symphony orchestra as best he could, combining all the advantages of the symphony orchestra with the things that only a synthesizer could do. The trick was that it was all synthesized. Each track had to be played over itself, and only one line could be played at a time. Because all of these synthesizers he was working with were monophonic, if you played two notes at the same time, only one note would sound. They're not the polyphonic instruments where today you can just slam a whole bunch of notes down, they all play. It took over a year of work for Tomita to come out with this Debussy album, and when it did, it was rightfully hailed as an achievement in the purely electronic. While Carlos had introduced the idea of recreating classic pieces in synthesis, Tomita took it a step further, and his achievement was even more groundbreaking because he was able to build off of what had already existed in the admittedly very small field. For heist film fans, it's Tomita's rendition of Clair de Lune that ends the film Ocean's 13. The Debussy album, entitled Snowflakes Are Dancing, was nominated for 4 Grammys in 1974, and the Electric Light Orchestra took to using it as their equivalent of an opening act. While Tomita still worked in original scores for Japanese film and television productions, his main claim to fame was in electronic realizations of great pieces from the classical repertory. This included Modest Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition, which was also electronically rendered by the progressive rock group Emerson, Lake and Palmer, as well as Gustav Holst's The Planets, which actually got him into a little bit of trouble. You see, he was fond of adding his own bells and whistles, his own sections, his own little interpretations, things that only he could achieve in only his studio. And this offended the sensibilities of Imogen Holst when she heard that a bunch of space-agey bells and whistles and sections had been added to her father's work. She was the composer in her own right and the executor of her father's estate, and it was through her actions that Tomita's version of The Planets, in its original vinyl version, is a bit of a collector's item. Tomita's version of Mars begins with a toy piano-like rendition of one of the themes from Jupiter, before going into a full blast-off sequence that sounds very realistic, including a synthesized sound that sounds like it's coming from over some kind of intercom. And finally, Mars, the Bringer of War, the actual rendition of what Holst wrote in that movement, starts at after the 3-minute mark. Throughout all of his renditions, he was known for having highly realistic string sounds, even more realistic than some modern-day samples. As technology advanced by leaps and bounds, so too did Tomita's music. Moving away from creating the arrangements that had brought him so much fame and publicity, he began a career as what you might call a DJ. He performed concerts by mixing tracks live to massive audiences the world over. He called these his Sound Cloud concerts, and performed them intermittently between 1984 and 1997. This included Austria's famed Ars Electronica Festival to Australia's bicentennial celebration and more. And at each successive SoundCloud concert, things would become more and more of a spectacle. You'd have guest artists coming in, you'd have record-breaking numbers of fireworks, and just a whole bunch of things. It is through these concerts that people like Stevie Wonder and Ray Charles got to know Tomita. Michael Jackson paid Tomita a visit in his home studio in 1987, in an affair that, according to legend, got the translator drunk on sake. Footage shows Jackson utterly entranced, and the two planned to collaborate, although this never came to fruition. Tomita also pursued electroacoustic composition on a wide scale. We're talking massive symphony orchestras augmented with the use of electronics. His Symphony Iatov, written for a 2012 premiere in Tokyo, has as its featured soloist Hatsune Miku, a fully digital singer-celebrity technically called a Vocaloid. But all was not rosy for Tomita in his personal life, for he suffered from heart disease for many years. He died from this disease in May 2016, at the age of 84. Tomita's legacy rests on the world of electronics, obviously, and he was always pushing the boundaries of what was actually possible given the limits of the technology he had in whatever year it was. This was especially true in the number of distinct audio channels he would use. If he had the option of creating a 5-channel mix, rest assured he was going to use a 5-channel mix. He was one of the first to do this, and he dubbed it Pyramid Sound because it added another layer on top, in addition to the quadraphonic stereo mix of the different corners of front and back. He embraced digital technology at the earliest possible time, 1984 in fact, before he reincorporated the analog into his studio because he realized that they could act as non-overlapping magisteria. Basic techniques like phasing and flanging, things that are hallmarks of today's electronic dance music producers, are found in Tomita's work as early as the 1970s. And again, this is just a filter you can add in GarageBand now, but somebody had to invent it and somebody had to pioneer its use, and that was Tomita. It strikes the listener as a baffling achievement, difficult even with today's synthesizers, but even more so when you realize the limits of the analog technology with which he worked for most of his career.